All right. Welcome to the start of the 23-24 International Leadership Series. My name is Dr. Nicholas Hudson, and I serve as the Director of the Office of Student Orientation, Leadership, and Engagement. And on behalf of our office, as well as the Office of International Engagement, which is a joint program that we put on, I'd like to welcome you all to the start of this year's series as we move through. And so this year, I'm just going to quickly the International Leadership Series has a theme that is associated with it each year. This year, our focus is on peace and conflict. And we really focus the lectures that we have and conversations around one of the 7 elements of global citizenship as defined by Oxfam. Some of our previous years themes have been social justice and equity, human rights. This year, we're again peace and conflict. We've done identity and development. Power and governance was last year, globalization and sustainable development. For those students in the room, one of the most prestigious awards that is offered by the university is the International Leadership Fellows. This is a long-standing award that we've had here at this institution, along with this lecture series. For those of you who are interested in this, including those that are online, because this will be going to students across the TAMU community, so not just here in Laredo, but you'd need to attend either in person or virtually 5 of 6 sessions. Also, you will need to participate in the Art for Social Change competition in spring 2024. There's prompts associated with it. Some of the benefits, you do get recognized at Emerging Leader Celebration in April, as well as you get a medal from the university. It's one of the only awards that is honored that has a medal for our students. So to help us all kind of understand what are we looking for across our 6 lectures this year, I wanted to at least start us off as defining peace, conflict across the variety of topics that we have associated. So our working definitions that we have for this year are 2. There's positive peace, which is attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So we can think of maybe the United Nations on certain levels. And then there's also negative peace, that is the absence of violence or fear of violence. You'll be getting a survey asking you, what did we define these as we move throughout here as part of our learning outcomes. We also want to be able to define what is conflict. And so we're going to base our conversation this year of conflict being defined as, and conceptually defined as, a form of intense inter or intrapersonal dissonance, right? Tension or antagonism between 2 or more interdependent parties. So that may be having incompatible goals, needs, desires, values, beliefs, and attitudes. This could be on an international scale, as we're talking today, or it could be at a student organization level. Conflict exists between societies and individuals across the board. And we do this in the lens of our concept of social justice, which is really the inclusion of everyone into the full benefits of society. And it's really about the empowerment of people to participate fully in the cultural, economic, political, and social life of the country. It would be remiss when we're talking about peace and conflict if we did not actually talk a little bit about power, which is the ability or official authority to decide what is best for others. And so as we begin looking through our conversations here this year, want this concept of power to be with us on really who has access to resources and the capacity to exercise control over others. And within that larger context, we also have some working definitions as it relates to privilege, right? Those that have unearned access to resources only readily available to certain groups. And then finally, understanding that we do live in oppressive structures, and some of our oppressive structures and systems maintain advantage and disadvantage based off of different social group memberships. So these are some of just the kind of theoretical frameworks that I want our students and those joining us to have here across the board. But today we are very excited to start us off with a talk by one of TAMIU's newest faculty members, Asligul Berktay, who is an assistant professor in history, really talking about Enclosed by Colonial History and Neoliberalism, a conversation as related to land and indigenous rights in Brazil and Ecuador. And so just a little bit about Dr. Berktay is a scholar of the Atlantic world, of the slave trade and the enslaved experience, of African and African diaspora history, as well as critical race theory. And that aligns with my background. I'm also a critical race theorist in many ways as well. She is equally trained in African and Latin American history. First book was published in 2009, and her current book project analyzes the wills of free Africans in 19th century Salvador, Brazil. Prior to joining TAMIU, taught at different disciplines at Tulane University in New Orleans, Bosphorus University, Sanabi University, and Bilgi University in Turkey, and was part of NIU Shanghai and East China Normal University. Dr. Berktay has conducted both historical and ethnographic research in 9 countries and is fluent in 14 different languages, which is just a treat to welcome into TAMIU. So let's give her a warm Dust Devil welcome, Dr. Berktay. Sorry, no, I can just... Okay. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. Well, that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today to hear me talk about a subject that is very near and dear to me. So I have been involved with the indigenous movement in Brazil for over 10 years now. A lot of the people that I will even be showing in pictures are my close friends, just like the person who took the photo that you see on top is. So normally when doing comparative work, I always tell students to be careful with 2 things. One, your comparisons should work, right? So you shouldn't compare a country and a continent, or you shouldn't compare contexts that are radically different from one another. But also you should have equity among your comparisons, which is rare, right? We often know one thing much better than the other. So I tried to counterbalance that. And because of that, I put in way too much on Ecuador, because that is a context that I don't know personally, and almost ended up having more than on Brazil. But I also recently found out that I have 20 minutes almost less than I thought I was gonna have. So I'm gonna be rushing through a lot of this stuff anyways. But so when you look at the photo, so that is by my friend, so Edgar Kanaiku Shakriaba, who is a Shakriaba Indian from the southeastern province of Minas Gerais in Brazil. He's an ethnophotographer and indigenous activist. And what you see here basically is the Palácio do Planalto. So that is the presidential palace in Brasilia. And those people are Xingu Indian activists. Actually, the one in the front is Takuan Puikuro, who is also an indigenous filmmaker who recently got several awards. But the Planalto is also the region of Brazil, where the capital was artificially located in the middle of the country, very close to a lot of very important indigenous territories. So this is symbolic in a lot of levels. because basically the Brazilian state has colonized indigenous territory, right? And also the Brazilian state has had a very negative influence, of course, on indigenous existence and rights in Brazil. I was going to talk about like where have we, recently heard Ecuador's name, whatever. I am going to skip all that, but about the assassination on August 9th of the presidential candidate in Ecuador, hopefully. So enclose by the concept of enclosure, right? What is enclosure? So the historical process of enclosure refers to the expropriation whereby land and wealth owned in common is privatized, and formerly free persons are brought into disciplinary institutions. It can also refer to the gradual disappearance of freedoms, identity, rights, and personhood. It's a concept that is central to a lot that is of interest to both historians and anthropologists, such as the concepts of personhood, ownership, cartography, settler colonialism, power, dispossession, and difference. So there are obviously many, examples that you can think of enclosure. So this is the rabbit-proof pens in Australia of Aboriginal peoples, right? You can obviously think of a Native American reservation. You can think of a slave ship, right? And then what is neoliberalism? So it is a term that is used to signify the late 20th century political reappearance of 19th century ideas associated with free market capitalism, right? After the initial decline of these concepts after World War II. So we generally associate it with policies of economic liberalization, such as privatization, deregulation, free trade, so on and so forth. And in Latin America, the 1980s and 90s saw a surge of neoliberalism, right, in many places. And, but in many places also it failed miserably. So lessons not learned. Recently, political elites in Latin America have started pursuing such policies again. So I will be talking about the Amazon. If you were here, in time to see parts of the video, the music video that I showed, that is the 2017 Samba de Enredo that the Escola de Samba Imperatriz proposed for that year's Carnaval, because a lot of these issues were very much in the forefront at that time, and they still are. But if you paid attention, it has a lot of the elements that I will be talking about when I come to the Amazon. So basically 9 countries share the Amazon basin, right? But what you should keep in mind is that more than 58% of the rainforest is within Brazil, and only 1% is within the borders of Ecuador. So I'm going to be talking about, obviously not going to be talking about all the Ecuadorian presidents. I'm going to look at 2 different moments, 1992 and 2021-22 in Ecuador's history. So in Ecuador, we have 14 distinct indigenous peoples. And, they're supposed to be, according to the census, about 6.8% of the population. But the main indigenous organization, CONAIE, believes that even half of the country might actually be indigenous, but that also depends on how you define being indigenous, right? So indigenous organizations occupy 3 tiers, right? The top tier is the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities, so CONAIE. The second tier has 3 regional confederations. And basically, the local tier that I will be concentrating upon is the OPIP. So it is the local level federation of Pastaza province, which is a part of the Oriente region, also known as Región Amazónica, in eastern Ecuador. So it's basically covers the lowland areas of the Amazon basin. So in 1992, in April, over 20,000 Quechua, Achuar, and Shiriar Indians marched from Pastaza province to Quito. And along the way, it takes them about 2 weeks to complete this march. Along the way, they acquire extreme levels of support. So they're asking for two things, land adjudication and constitutional reform. So in the Ecuadorian context, what these land rights mean is the communal titling of 2 million hectares of contiguous rainforest territory in Pastaza. So this is a picture from the march. And so basically it garnered loads of media attention. And, while a lot of different indigenous groups joined, actually the country's mestizo and blanco elite also joined. And it became this national and international spectacle. And, the activists who were directing the march were very much aware of that at all times. And the second demand that they had was for constitutional reform that would declare Ecuador a plurinational state. So the leaders underlined the fact that this was a nation composed of multiple, discrete, though interconnected peoples, and that it should be the way for it to be recognized. And like I said, it garnered huge support. And of course, 1992 is the anniversary of 1492, 500 years. So there were many Pan-American Indian campaigns happening all over the Americas at the time. And so basically the Pastaza activists positioned themselves within that framework of 500 years of resistance. So like I said, solidarity came from many different directions. And at that time, the president, a left-leaning president, mind you, Rodrigo Borja Ceballos, agreed to receive and protect the marchers. Previously, he had denied their request for legal rights to their ancestral lands. So almost 2 weeks later, they arrive in Quito, right? An estimated number of 5,000 Indians. Like I said, their numbers really had grown along the way. And at Plaza San Blas, at the foot of the statue of the Amazonian hero Humandi, who had led the first real uprising, right, against the Spanish, they addressed the crowd by framing themselves as continuing the same 500-year struggle for Indian dignity and political autonomy. So even though he had promised not to do so, the state did not react well at all. There was huge military and police presence, highly armed, helicopters overhead. But the Indians said, we're not gonna budge until we can enter the presidential palace and have our demands be heard. So let's look at this mosaic, which is in the Ecuadorian presidential palace, right? It is by the most important Ecuadorian artist, Osvaldo Guayasamín. Right, so what does it say? El sacrificio de 3,000 aborígenes glorifica la presencia del Ecuador en el río de las Amazonas. So the full thing basically says Quito, March 1541, Atlantic Ocean, August 1542, and the origin of our destiny, the epic of Francisco Orellana. So basically the conquistador, right, who first comes to the Amazon. And the sacrifice of 3,000 Aboriginals glorifies the presence of Ecuador in the Amazon River. The route is marked by their blood in our spirit. So basically, the mosaic equates Orellana with our and us, the Ecuadorians. And so the community of Ecuador is imagined only as including those of European descent. And the indigenous people are banished to the fringes via both decree and omission. And, both the mosaic and the epigraph is basically also an epitaph for them, right? It's their tombstone. So great, you died, you got out of the way, now we can do our thing. So, and this is how they are perceived in the Ecuadorian national imaginary as well. So they're simply seen as part of the unfolding of an imperial and national drama, and otherwise they're anachronistic elements, remnants of the past, and certainly not relevant to Ecuador's present and future. And not only are they not relevant, they're also perceived as a constant obstacle in the face of elite white reason and progress. Right, so remember that Ecuador has 1% of the Amazon, but it is a nation that is literally obsessed with the Amazon, right? So the national motto is Ecuador was, is, and shall be an Amazonian country. And then there are many border treaties in which Ecuador gradually loses land to Peru. But actually in the Ecuadorian maps, this is almost never acknowledged, right? So the country continues to insist that the nation's true historical heritage is a sovereign right to the Amazon. I mean, even if it hadn't lost that much to Peru, how much of the Amazon was that going to be? Anyway, but of course, the region has crazy economic value, right? So, which becomes conflated with the state's, the symbolic value that the state places on it. And from its beginning, it's one, product or one crop after another. So from, medicinal plants such as sarsaparilla to rubber, gold, and finally, since its discovery in the mid-1960s, oil. Right, so normally when students usually tell me that a certain historical phenomenon that I want them to care about, say that it's like far away from them, or that it doesn't, apply to them, I start talking about global historical responsibility and how our existences are connected, whatever. That's a point that's very easy to make in this case, right? So, like I said, oil is discovered in the 60s, then Ecuador joins the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. So the colonization of the region of Oriente, which Pastaza is part of, becomes heightened, and then Texaco moves in, exploiting sizable oil reserves for over 25 years. And what Texaco does is to use outmoded and deteriorating equipment, which was forbidden in the US, contaminating sizable segments of the surface and subterranean water supplies and oil systems in the Northern Oriente. And you still have people, generations of people who are sick because of what Texaco did in the region. So beginning in the 50s and intensifying with the 64 agrarian reform law, homesteaders also more and more move into this region, which is primarily an indigenous region, right? So OPIP leaders and community members, and often, these activists had themselves worked for Texaco, right? Believe that along with further colonization, the devastating effects of oil in the north would soon threaten their territory as well. And they decide that self-organization is the way to go if they want to have even a very small effect on their future. So, in 1992, there have been other events as well. So there was the Sarayaco Accord in May 1989. Basically, indigenous people had confiscated the equipment of ARCO And, in response to that, different state and corporate officials fly to Sarayaku, and then, under indigenous insistence, they draft and sign an agreement in which they agree to grant communal title to all Indian territory. But they say that it wasn't a voluntary agreement, right? And that it had been signed under force, so that it's not valid. And they reach that conclusion in 8 months. So within 8 months, the state reverses its position, saying that the accord had taken place under force. And then there is a huge indigenous mobilization, which includes occupations, hunger strikes, also other kinds of movements to obstruct the workings of the Ecuadorian state and national economy. So basically, Indian communities forced the government to re-enter into negotiations. But as part of these CONAIE state negotiations, OPIP presents this Acuerdo Territorial, which has basically the same two themes, right? Plurinationality and self-determination, the communal titling of ancestral lands, and political, cultural, and economic control over them. So who you see here is the leader of OPIP at that time. And so the Acuerdo is actually a brilliant document because it really says what the indigenous people are trying to say. It brings together concerns for the environment, with the social memory of the peoples of Pastaza, and refers to the United Nations International Convention on the Rights of Indigenous People, and just basically presents indigenous demands and understandings in their language. And the Borja regime very quickly denounces the Acuerdo as subversive and unconstitutional. And one good point that they make is that having such language is going to kind of add to the stereotypes that Ecuadorians of Spanish descent primarily have. And those that language that is used, right, basically posits indigenous people as lazy, undeserving of land, as prone to extremes, inflammatory, and so on and so forth. So, and the administration then only partially concedes to indigenous demands and grants only 55% of the ancestral territory, but also engages in this, from the state's perspective, brilliant act of map making, where they artificially divide Indian lands into 19 land blocks that do not correspond to any actual indigenous understandings of their social divisions and how they delineate their territory at all. So I'm not going to go into this, but people define their identity as belonging to a nacionalidad or a pueblo, but while doing this, they're also locating themselves within a place filled with territory and history, right? It's not just about divisions of land. So these are actually, real divisions of land in Pastaza province. And they also establish a 40-kilometer wide security zone on the Peruvian border. It's not only international policing that they want to engage in, but of course, national policing, right? They want to control what's happening there, and they depict this area as if it were, empty, when obviously thousands of indigenous people are living there. This is the border. And so the government also extends the borders of Yasuni National Park, also depicted as blank white, as a blank and white space, even though so many people live there. And basically, the reason why they're doing this is also, they want to change those borders to avoid different lawsuits. And it's also a way of asserting their own understanding of the environment, So the environment is obviously very important, and Indigenous people are making very clear use of what we call eco-speak or environmental discourse, right? So they are embodying this language that is appearing, in every part of the world as the Amazon becomes more and more important to rally support for their cause by positing themselves as crusaders of the rainforest, right? Defenders of the Amazon, guardians of the Amazon is always part of their language. But they also denounce ecological imperialism, right? And this is very important because Indigenous people across Latin America often react very strongly against, people who go to the extremes in tropical conservation, maintaining that an integral component of Indigenous identity is the sustainable use of the tropical forest, right? The forest is not this like virgin domain that nobody touches. People have been using it for millennia, and they know how to use it. It's, others that don't. And they also recognize this landscape as a landscape that is shaped by conquest, colonization, and exploitation, right? It's a landscape of inequality. And this continues to inform their sense of self and their resolve to fight for a degree, let's say, of self-determination. And, basically, they achieve some level of success by bringing their own concerns together with these global environmental concerns of Western tropical conservation, and they create this space called Amazonia. This sometimes works against them because they're not the only ones who can use ecospeak, right? So basically, companies and the state also, use this discourse, and they manipulate ecological concerns to champion their own activities under the name of environmental cause, as they did with the Yasuni Park. ARCO even establishes an environmental committee to do that. And in the process, they fully deny that for Indigenous people, it's not only, the environment is not just geotechnical, right? It's also highly political, social, and cultural. In the end, and I'm gonna skip a whole bunch of this presentation because I'm worried about time and I do wanna talk about Brazil. In the end, what they achieve is, a very limited victory. So even though they are given, land titles, they're not giving them to their whole land, but also the title deeds limit the activities of Indigenous people within that land. And so it's incomplete and compromised. The state later begins to actually intensify exploration in the area. And this is what I'm gonna skip. So what we have starting in 2021 and continuing until today is the first right-wing conservative government in Ecuador under Guillermo Lasso. And basically in this context, and we also have this political party, the Pachakutik movement, that is founded in 95. So 3 years after the previous context that I was talking about, and after the government of Rafael Correa, when Lasso comes into the stage, Pachakutik actually supports Lasso. And within that movement, so the new, president of, so Guillermo Lasso has 1 million neoliberal policies. All right, horrible, horrible things. You can ask me about them if you like. But basically what the Indigenous movement realizes is that they can no longer depend on Pachakutik, and that they need to go back to their own organizational structures. So Leonidas Isa Salazar, who is the new leader of Kanaya at the time, starts engaging in direct organizing and mobilization. Actually, his demands are very, very mild, right? He's not asking for anything crazy. So when they're going to a national mobilization, they have 10 points that range from the freezing of fuel prices to a moratorium on the extractive frontiers. So exactly very similar things. And it's a platform built on consensus, dialogue, and communality. But Lasso doesn't perceive of it as such, and he arrests Leonidas Isa Salazar. And he has no legal backing, so it's fully unconstitutional, right? And in actually Ecuador, it would count as a kidnapping, which could lead to his impeachment. And then there is this giant indigenous uprising that forms, that moves on to Quito to take over the capital and to free Leonidas Ista. And actually, he is released within 24 hours of illegal detention. All right, so now that I have made a lot of these points clear, you're going to see them come up in the context of Brazil, and I'm going to be talking about these 4 different time periods primarily. And like I said, because I have a much greater commitment to Brazil, it's not going to be easy. Anyway, so there are about 305 indigenous groups living in Brazil today, right? It's much greater than the number that's in Ecuador. A lot of these people are actually not in the Amazon. So the first people that, colonizers come into contact with, the Guarani, are in the northeast and coastal areas, or, the Tupi that, are very famous for their anthropophagic activities, are also in coastal areas. But basically, nearly all of the reserve land, 98.5% of it lies in the Amazon region. This is Maria Yanomami of the Yanomami group. So in Brazil, indigenous organization is complex because FUNAI, which should be like FUNAIE in the Brazilian context, the Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, that was, founded in 1973 as the continuation of the Indian Protection Services, basically, is a very problematic state body. So the Indian statute has the main goal supposedly to integrate Indians, right? It already implies adaptation, integration, incorporation. And so that is people, can start contributing economically to society. So while in some ways it's great to have a government agency do this, but FUNAI often interferes, right, in not great ways in the region and in indigenous rights, and can act quite contrary to their welfare. So I'm sure you guys have seen this guy, right? He was also in the video that I showed. So this is Cacique Raoni, born in 1932, Raoni Metuktire, which has become probably one of the most important spokesperson for indigenous rights, basically. So he's the chief of the Kayapo, an indigenous group from Mato Grosso and Pará, so between northeast and the north in Brazil, right by the Xingu River. That's a tributary of the Amazon. And he's incredibly famous internationally as a living symbol for the fight for indigenous rights, but also for the environment. So basically what's important to remember here is that his first encounter with the outside world happens in 1954. Okay, this is really quite late. And he's initiated into the Portuguese language by the famous indigenous anthropologist Orlando Villas-Boas. And basically Brazil is still home to more than 100 uncontacted peoples. Often, more and more groups are found. So this deforestation becomes very early on a cause for Raoni. And starting already in the decade of the 80s, he makes his way into both national and international media as the banner bearer for the Amazon rainforest. And the main issues that he raises at the time are illegal deforestation, increasing cultivation of soybeans, and hydroelectric dams. So Sting does a lot of work with them, right? And these huge international campaigns, and through which he realizes his dream, basically, which was to have ancestral territorial rights to Kayapo territory. And in 1993, funds raised worldwide helped make his dream come true, and the Xingu's indigenous lands are reunited. So the Article 231 of the Brazilian Constitution of 1988 basically recognizes the rights of indigenous people to exist as themselves, and also to have ownership over their ancestral lands. Of course, this doesn't really happen to be the case. So the demarcação das terras indígenas has been very much challenged by this loophole in the law that we call the Marco Temporal, which basically, and of course the Bolsonaro government fully supported this, because that's really important land, right? Full of riches. So basically what the Marco Temporal says is that by the time of the 1988 Constitution, if you weren't in your ancestral lands, then you actually are not entitled to them, which is obviously extremely problematic in a context where many indigenous groups were pushed out or had to leave their territories and could only return after the demarcação. So there were three important slogans in this movement. One is Nossa história começa antes de 1500. So our history starts before. Marco Temporal now, you could see this everywhere, and I love this logo. And basically, on the 21st of September this month, the indigenous people won a very important victory, but we'll see for how long, right? So the Supreme Court said no to the Marco Temporal. And this slogan, which I love also, Brasil Terra Indígena. So another thing that was very important for Cacique Raoni was this giant dam project on the Xingu River. So this was a project that was started very early on. So do you remember the song? Carao, Cararao. So it was the initial name of the dam that also is the name of one of the indigenous groups that live there. So it was supposed to be in the Cararao area, right, in the northern part of the Xingu River. And it was going to be, it was completed in 2019, unfortunately, and it is disastrous. It has been disastrous for both the environment and the indigenous people. And from very early on, indigenous, mobilization against it was extremely strong. I can't get into details. I'm going to skip another part. But so the Kayapo, Raoni's people are centered in Altamira. So there was this Altamira gathering, that's caused this very large indigenous mobilization. And that's how Carará was renamed Belo Monte. And originally 6 dams were planned, 5 were canceled, but not Belo Monte. Environmental impact is like off the roof. It's been causing, huge loss already. It's going to cause a lot more over time. And of course, the social and cultural damage is even greater. So this is the area that Cacique Raoni was so happy to have the demarcação for, right? This is the Xingu National Park, Parque Indígena do Xingu, where I stayed for 3 months once and then used to visit every summer before COVID hit. So it's initially created in 1961 in Mato Grosso, and its official purposes are to protect the environment, but especially the indigenous peoples. So there are many different groups that live there, that live fully there. The Kayapo are divided between the Xingu, but also in other areas. So like I said, centered in Altamira. So they don't count as one of the groups that are only located within the Xingu. And these are pictures I took. So I wanted to, I decided that posting pictures of myself in such clothes was not, a very smart thing to do in my first academic presentation here. So decided just to post some that I took. So this is during the yearly festival of Quarup. Basically, so the whole Xingu area, there are many villages of all those ethnicities. I spent most time in the Yawalapiti and Kuikuro villages. Every year, the Quarup festival is held in one village. So it alternates. I also took this one, which I really like. And so, Dilma Rousseff that governed under PT, so supposedly the Workers' Party, is the person who in the end made Belo Monte happen, right? So apparently she had accepted a lot of money from overpriced contracts to sponsor her campaign. And when this became obvious, a nationwide mobilization ensued, but it was unfortunately not sufficient to stop the construction of the dam. At that time, on social media, we used the hashtag Guarani Kaiowá, and many of us changed our last name. So I was asked the Berktay Guarani Kaiowá on Instagram and Facebook and other things. So yeah, a lot of protests against Dilma. And so yeah, Cacique Raoni, this is a petition that he had against Dilma. I'll be done very soon. So what is the situation today? It's pretty grim. So, Lula was also not innocent in all of this, by the way, but he's like better than others. And, he's also seen, political opportunity in being able to accuse his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, of committing genocide against the Yanomami. So basically what happens is that all these illegal gold miners, around 20,000 of them, have entered the Yanomami area, which is the biggest indigenous area in Brazil. And they have basically poisoned rivers, wrecked forests, kicked people out. They have engaged in sexual violence against Yanomami women. They have killed, and if not threatened, indigenous peoples. And so basically, I also fully agree that what Jair Bolsonaro did was a full-on genocide against the Yanomami, but also against other indigenous peoples. When I think of them, the Buddhist in me loses her internal peace, and I start dreaming up nightmarish reincarnations for them. But if you haven't read this book, The Falling Sky, A Queda do Céu in the original, La Queda del Cielo, is translated into basically every language in the world. Please read it. Bruce Albert is a very important anthropologist, but David Copenhagen, and I'll speak about him in a moment for just 2 minutes, is a very important Yanomami activist. So close to 30,000 Yanomami live in the indigenous territory. They're also the people who possess the largest indigenous territory in Brazil, about the size of Indiana, right? Illegal miners. So he is the other guy right next to Cacique Raoni. And, born in 1956, he is a shaman, a Yanomami shaman, and Portuguese-speaking spokesperson. He has received 1 million awards. So, he's been very, very local about the catastrophic impact of the garimpeiros, now around 40,000 or gold miners, illegal gold miners on the indigenous peoples. And I will mention one other indigenous leader that has done really great work. So he's based in Minas Gerais, between the center of the country and the southeast. Ailton Alish Lacerda Krenak, born in 1954, is a writer, journalist, philosopher, and indigenous leader of Krenak ethnicity. He was forcibly separated from his people, of which only 130 individuals are left today at age 9. And he's worked as a representative of indigenous peoples during the 1988 debates for the Brazilian Constitution. And he has either co-founded or participated in several indigenous rights organizations. And that's Ailton Krenak. Now, I'm gonna go back to this issue of sexual violence. Por que os garimpeiros comem as vaginas das mulheres Yanomami? Why do the illegal gold miners eat the vaginas of Yanomami women? The rape cases reach such insane numbers that they really became impossible to ignore. And I'm going to talk about this one case that happened in 2016, which I literally cried for over a week, when this happened. So basically, there is, in the afternoon of December 30, 2016, a Koingang mother is in Santa Catarina, so in the very south of the country, right, of where there are like Gisele Bündchens from here, right? Like, so, a lot of German influenced people of German descent. It's also a very rich area, but a lot of indigenous people, come here to sell their crafts. So this mother is literally breastfeeding her 2-year-old on a sidewalk outside a bus station, and the security camera catches this. This white stranger calmly approaches them, first touches the baby's face and then cuts his throat. And what was worse than what happened was that this didn't even make headlines in Brazil. Nobody even thought it was newsworthy, right? So these are all my translations from Portuguese. They might not be the best. They were done at 4 a.m. this morning. So, but I will underline some parts, right? So baby, but indigenous, small, but indigenous, a victim, but indigenous, right? This but is the hidden murderer. This but is a serial killer. Eliane Brum is a Brazilian journalist who writes for El País. And Valdir Rampinelli is a historian of Brazil, right? And so racism against indigenous people is historical. As soon as Brazil became independent, nothing changed for the indigenous peoples. This prejudice against indigenous peoples prevails today, obviously. I mean, this could have never happened with a white child. And Elaine Tavares is a journalist actually from Santa Catarina, where this happened. And so when Spanish and Portuguese explorers arrived, right, Indians were branded as non-humans, second-class citizens, unfaithful, and useless, right? It's okay as long as they stay in their place and, respect white authority and economic interests. But the moment they decide to go out and share the white world's life, then the thing becomes ugly. And this is how, unfortunately, colonial history connects very directly to the present. But I don't want to end on that note. The note that I would like to end on is this. which I explained already, and this, O futuro indígena, the future is indigenous. Thank you.
Its presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Berktay, for this conversation around Indigenous land rights and environmentalism in the ways, peaceful ways, in many aspects, the Indigenous people in South America are working towards ensuring their rights as individuals are maintained. So we'll open up for a couple of questions from folks in the audience. Yes, right here.
Do you plan to have any courses, like semester?
Such a great question.
Like, if there is interest, I'll teach it very, very happily.
That was great.
Yeah, so that is, yeah, so I absolutely, we'll make sure we get that somewhere.
With your time that you spent in Brazil, did you by any chance participate in any of the protests? And if so, what were your thoughts going through?
Oh, I have participated in dozens of protests, and I have met both Cacique Raoni and Dani Popinava, and also Elton Fenech personally, numerous times. And I mean, it's, when we speak about this, for example, in the US context, we speak about these issues as things that happened in the past, like Indigenous genocide, for example. But all over Latin America, it's extremely present. And, also the case of Indigenous peoples very much connects to the case of people of African descent in the continent. Intersectionality is present at every level. It connects very clearly, as you saw, to gender issues, right? Indigenous women are the most vulnerable people in all these situations. One thing I can say is Brazil has, and so does Ecuador, so does Venezuela. I couldn't talk about all the context that I would like to talk about. Very strong Indigenous mobilization. And a lot of the young generation is fighting on so many different levels. You saw, like, for example, Edgar is an ethnophotographer, and he uses photography as an instrument, right? There are Indigenous filmmakers. There are people who are involved in government organizations. There are people who very actively use the internet, and people who are in environmental organizations. There is cross-country regional solidarities. Right now, for example, and like I said, in the case of the Yanomami especially, their indigenous territory is partially within Brazil, partially within Venezuela. So there is a lot of cooperation and collaboration among indigenous people from Venezuela and from Brazil. Another friend of mine is at the border now and keeps crossing back and forth for that. So, people are not going to let go. And I believe in that. That's why I wanted to end on that note and not on a note of failure and continued suffering.
There's a program that it's a study abroad that yours truly runs. We actually go and visit with Indigenous folks that span both Argentina and Brazil. And we talk about some of these similar issues in South America, that Indigenous rights, women rights, Afro-Argentine, a very limited visibility population that does exist comparatively. So there's some opportunities to also engage in that as we move forward. We have time for one final question if there are any. Well, once again, let's give Dr. Berktay a warm, well, thank you. This is part of our TAMIU's official Hispanic Heritage Month celebration, a month-long worth of events. But I think we noticed today that it's not necessarily Hispanic Heritage Month that we are celebrating. It's more so Latin American or Latino heritage celebration on many levels, because the indigenous languages present in Latin America and South America, as well as the Afro South Americans themselves in Brazil speak Portuguese for the most part. And so just being mindful that it's not just necessarily Hispanic individuals, but it's all of it.
Portuguese speakers, Brazilians are grouped now under Hispanic.
Correct.
Mhm.
But not just those associated with necessarily Spanish. Nonetheless, I greatly appreciate you, Dr. Berktay, for coming in. We have another one of these on October 25th with Dr. Nola Garcia, who will be speaking on social media and organized crime, and an interesting topic nonetheless. So we'll continue to have these conversations throughout. Thank you all very much.
Not forget my USB.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
just gonna stop the record though.